Each one of the panelists will have 10 minutes to talk about the idea of dangerous voices from their perspective. Some are Victoria scholars, some are period scholars. And and then we'll open it up and we can have hopefully some pretty amazing discussions and questions. So who's going first? I forget. Yeah. So I guess we will go. I'll introduce. Oh, yes, Cindy's starting, aren't you? We were doing this over dinner. We know who the last two are, but not the first two. I think Cindy's starting, right? So this is Cindy Safranoff, and if you would like to introduce anything more about yourself, but she is wins the prize for the longest trip here. She's from Seattle, Washington, and yeah, pulled kind of an all-nighter for us, so we're pretty thankful. So, Cindy, go ahead.
Hi, again, I'm Cindy Safranoff, and I spent more than 3 years immersed in Victoria Woodhull's life and the issues that she raised while I was writing my book, Crossing Swords. And I really came to realize what a significant historical figure she is, the extent of her influence, but also how her history was virtually invisible to me prior to my project. And I did not start out to write a Victoria Woodhull biography. I started out writing a biography about Mary Baker Eddy, and I wanted to set her statements about marriage and womanhood, these things, and women's rights, these things we call women's issues, which really relate to everyone. They're everyone's issues, but we call them women's issues. I was trying to set them into historic context. I wanted to understand how people would have perceived her statements at the time she said them. And really, I was going to, this was going to be a whole lengthy history involving her whole life. But at one point, I discovered Victoria Woodhull and how Woodhull came into play in Mary Baker Eddy's life. And I started to think, well, gosh, I'm going to have a chapter that's going to include Victoria Woodhull. But she wasn't even going to be the focus. But the more I kept coming back to Victoria Woodhull, I kept seeing more and more her significance, her influence. And eventually, that one chapter became the focus of the book. And eventually, it became a dual biography where I gave the two women equal time. And I tried to treat them with equal fairness. And just in case anybody doesn't know, Mary Baker Eddy was a Christian leader, a religious leader who lived a very similar lifespan as Victoria Woodhull. So primarily 19th century. So what I was saying about Victoria Woodhull's history being invisible, I found that Victoria Woodhull's issues were embedded within certain statements that Mary Baker Eddy made. So I found that Mary Baker Eddy was responding to these issues that Woodhull was raising, just not using her name and not referencing her. But I realized that the reason I gave them equal standing in my book is I found that I couldn't really do justice to the issue without really including Woodhull as a significant figure. And I've really come to appreciate, too, the extent of Woodhull's fame. I really believe what I tell people is that at certain points in time, Victoria Woodhull was probably the most famous woman in America. She was like in the same way that maybe Hillary Clinton was a few years ago, where she was on everybody's mind. Everybody knew who she was. She was in the news. People talked about her. What launched my journey with Victoria Woodhull was one statement that Mary Baker Eddy made on the topic of wedlock, where she referred to crossing swords and free love and the year 1875. She said it was about the year 1875 that she crossed swords with free love. And that's what launched my research, is what did she mean, crossing swords? What was free love exactly in 1875, and what happened? And I think that in America at that time, anyone who lived during that time would have known that Mary Baker Eddy was talking about Victoria Woodhull. She didn't have to say it. In the same way that if, for our generation, if I said Apollo mission, giant leap, 1969, who am I talking about? Neil Armstrong, right? You just know it. And that's how Victoria Woodhull was. If you said 1875 and free love, people are going to say, ooh, Woodhull. And another famous statement by Mary Baker Eddy where she says, this is woman's hour. And she defends woman's right to hold the highest office in the land. Well, she's talking about the presidency. Well, again, at the time she said that, if you put those words together, the audience would have immediately thought Victoria Woodhull, because she was the one who was running for president, not just in 1872, but she did again a couple more times. So during that time period, she was tightly associated with the idea of a woman running for president. And so it makes me wonder, well, what other significant historic figures were addressing Woodhull's issues, but without using her name? And so it takes a kind of an in-depth study, because it took me years to get to this point. And now when a lot of things that I read of Mary Baker Eddy, I can see, oh, there's another place where she's addressing Victoria Woodhull's issues, and that were previously invisible to me, but now I can see them. And I do. This is an area that I do plan to continue doing research on. I'm hoping to write a sequel. But it takes years to do these kind of things. And I would like to say too, for Mary Baker Eddy to defend women's right to run for president at that time was a dangerous, risky thing to say, because there was this provocativeness that surrounded Victoria Woodhull, and so many people were distancing themselves from her publicly. And that's part of why she is so invisible today, because she's more or less got written out of history. So, and in my study, because I was comparing and contrasting the lives, the careers, and the public statements of these two most famous women in America figures, the way I frame these issues, these dangerous issues that run counter to social etiquette and mores, I frame the issue as this was an American marriage debate, very similar to the one that America went through several years ago. And in fact, I was doing my research during that American marriage debate, and so I was seeing a lot of similarities. I'm like, hey, this was just like what was going on in America when Victoria Woodhull was the most famous woman in America. So that's why I call it the Great American Marriage Debate of the early 1870s, when women's rights was the new thing. So that's how I introduce the topic to people, and it helps people resonate with this. And at that time, the term women's rights, just that term, was very provocative and controversial. And not all women supported women's rights. And even within the women's rights movement, it was very divisive within, where you had two camps, Victoria Woodhull and the New York faction of the women's rights movement had different ideas than the Boston faction in terms of how women's rights was going to impact the institution of marriage. So I guess I'm going to just conclude my spot by saying that I really see a need for deeper scholarship on Victoria Woodhull, and was really excited to hear about what the Robbins Hunter Museum is doing with primary source material, and that is so needed because Victoria Woodhull is a very difficult biographical topic. She really is. There's not a lot of information to go on, and there's a lot of ambiguity and confusion and different takes on what just the most basic facts are just not clear in a lot of things. And so I'm really excited about what you guys are doing, and I look forward to hopefully taking advantage of it in the future. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, I'm Carrie Carpenter, coming from West Virginia University, so not too terribly far away. I did want to just thank, first of all, Judith and Ann and Christina and everyone else who brought us here. This is so exciting because I'm not used to being places where people are aware of who Victoria Woodhull was. So it's quite exciting to walk around and see her in statue form and all of that. And Victorian underwear and the whole thing. It's been really exciting. And I did just want to show you, speaking of Tinny, her sister Tennessee, I have a chapter in here, which is a book, it's a beautiful book published in Portugal about the estate that, in commemoration of the estate where she and her husband lived in Portugal, at Sintra. And they wanted to have some information about her. So if you're interested in this, you're welcome to look at it. It's very heavy, but I thought it was a beautiful book, so I wanted to bring it and share it with you. Okay. To the extent that anyone's life reflects the time in which she lives, Victoria Claflin Woodhull embodies hers. Born a year after Morse's development of the electric telegraph in the United States, she died not long after promising $5,000 to the first person to fly across the Atlantic. Like the inventions her life witnessed, she crossed what others deemed uncrossable. First and foremost a performer, her extravagant crossovers occurred on stage, as she delivered speeches perhaps even more shocking by today's standards, speeches that espoused free love, a more equal distribution of wealth, and women's rights. In Amanda Friskin's words, Victoria Woodhull was one of the most powerful speakers of the time. Her contribution was to act out the period's most extreme positions on a public stage. I've chosen to focus today on two speeches of Woodhull's that have not received much attention, but which I would argue are crucial to understanding the convergence of what seems like contradictory beliefs: feminism, sexual science, religion, and eugenics. While scholars tend to divide her life into two distinct phases, her early progressive commitment to free love and her later conservative eugenics, I hope to show that the two are more connected than previously imagined, and that they need to be refigured in order to understand both her and her context. Such analysis of speeches like An Elixir of Life, which was written in 1873, and The Garden of Eden reveal that Woodhull was at once more and less progressive than our historical memory has allowed. At first glance, Woodhull seems to be a woman of great contradictions. She was the first to print Marx's manifesto in the United States, even as she and her sister Tenny, using Cornelius Vanderbilt's money, were the first known female stockbrokers in New York City. She condemned masturbation at the same time that she called for what we would now deem sex education. She described herself as a spiritualist and once spoke of the limits of a church creed while infusing many of her later speeches with biblical scripture. It is our 21st century lens, however, that makes these seem like contradictions. Many of her ostensibly paradoxical beliefs were consistent with those of the time. In blasting solitary vice, for example, she borrowed from the 19th century hygiene movement that deemed masturbation as dangerous in part because it wasted critical bodily resources. Consider A Lecture to Young Men, a book by Alexander Graham, who is now known most famously as the inventor of the graham cracker. I know you'll never look at graham crackers the same way, but therefore that the emission of semen enfeebles the body more than the loss of 20 times the same quantity of blood, more than violent cathartics and emetics, and hence the frequent and excessive loss of it cannot fail to produce the most extreme debility and disorder and wretchedness of both body and mind. Woodhull's who knew? Woodhull's The Elixir of Life expresses a similar sentiment. With this knowledge of masturbation added to the stifled but still growing passion, they decline into a morbid sexual condition which, running into years, carries them beyond the possibility of a return to natural and healthy action to maturity, utterly ruined sexually and physically. While Graham and Woodhull ultimately reached different conclusions, both were preoccupied by what they saw as improper sexuality. Marshalling various medical and religious literature, Woodhull, not unlike the hygienist, sketched a vision of sexual health that seems rather draconian today. It is not difficult to draw a connection between such writing and a later eugenic preoccupation with the so-called fit and unfit. Given these parameters on sexuality, free love becomes something else indeed. Woodhull's preoccupation with sexuality was accompanied by an increasing use of Christianity. The Garden of Eden from 1876 is a symbolic tour de force that figures the human body as Eden. And if you read it, I reread it last night, and I was struck by how actually she's reading the body as Eden and vice versa. It's really amazing text. Despite the fact that it has gained little attention in studies of Woodhull, I would argue that it embodies her profound, seemingly contradictory devotion to feminism, sexual science, spiritualism, and eugenics. It allowed her to talk about the body, something she did earlier quite frequently, through a more acceptable Christian lens. In this sense, the body becomes a place of purity, of the highest and finest functions. Each body part and function corresponds to a divine geography, she said, as she writes, "How is the body watered and fed? Is it not by a stream which is the extension of the mouth and that changes constantly as it encircles the system? Does not the support of the body enter it by the mouth, and by the river which is the extension of the mouth run to the stomach?" She notes that as the river Pison branches, so does the body branch into the heart and lungs. And these are her words. "A river, to water the land of pleasure and delight, enters by the mouth, and extending by the way of the stomach, intestines, heart, lungs, arteries, and veins, waters the whole land that suffers pain and brings forth." Unquote. The process of excretion becomes a process of grace, of natural and involuntary purification. Thus, one of the most vulgar aspects of the human body, and one at the time was of great concern to urban dwellers, is sanctified. She does not shirk from explicit images, remarking that the description of the swift current of the river Hiddekel is the precise sound of urination. The second to last paragraph is crowded with exclamation marks to give the piece a sense of religious exaltation that would be appropriate given her mother's experience with revivals of the Great Awakening. As she said, "Welcome, thrice welcome, thou messenger of God," and it goes on for several lines. It's pretty amazing. So indeed, biblical scripture becomes a compelling way for Woodhull, increasingly dependent on public approval, to discuss sexuality. As Altina Waller has argued in her analysis of Elizabeth Tilton Beecher's Gospel of Love, held that women were of a higher sensitive nature that made them closer to God and at the same time more vulnerable to victimization. In these terms, religious affect is akin to, and perhaps a safer vehicle for, sexual passion. As Joanne Passett notes, Woodhull began to infuse her speeches with biblical scripture in 1874, using her Bible and her daughter, who often read a religious piece, as props. The Christian ethos was adopted even before this, however. An article from the Detroit Union of 1873 notes her regret that her words might be construed into a lack of veneration for Christ. She was a religious woman and revered him and his doctrines. And as Mary Gabriel notes, beginning in 1875, the weekly ran stories endorsing Catholicism, a trend that irked some spiritualists. In some sense, however, the Christian thread had been there all along. I thought it was interesting what you were saying about her connection to Mary Eddy, given, of course, Mary Eddy's Christianity. So, definite connection there. In some sense, the Christian thread had been there all along, but while her critics condemned her decision to embrace Christianity as hollow and opportunistic, it was not, in fact, a radical departure for her. Much of the theory of social freedom she had previously preached was found in the polished socialism of the 1850s. Woodhull mined Christian rhetoric throughout her life, whether speaking of sexual science, eugenics, or free love. The bridge between Woodhull's free love ideology and her commitment to sexual science and eugenics is also evident in earlier speeches like The Elixir of Life, which she gave to the American Association of Spiritualists in 1873. At first glance, the speech seems consistent with many feminist beliefs today. Women defines free love in contrast to the brutal lust to which married women are frequently subjected by their husbands, women's stifled sexual desire, and the hypocrisy of men who preach purity and yet pursue extramarital affairs. As Woodhull declares, is it not foolish then, is it not more than this, is it not criminal, longer to attempt to place limits upon this heaven-ordained passion? Although it may be difficult for us to admit, some of Woodhull's eugenic rhetoric was matched with feminist beliefs. For example, using her own experience, she argued that unsatisfying marriages made for unfit offspring. Thus, it was for the good of the children that more egalitarian relationships were pursued. So I think of that as one way that she was actually able to use what is obviously this very eugenic language that should make us uncomfortable, but she's trying to use it in a feminist way. So that might be something to think more about. It was for the good of the children that more egalitarian relationships were pursued. In her endorsement of consensual sexual relations based on love, even and especially outside of the despotism of marriage, she raises astonishingly modern questions about whether sexuality might exist outside of patriarchal oppression. Yet embedded within the elixir of life is an artful rhetoric that depends on a more conservative moral and immoral binary. As she states, I indeed thank heaven for giving me the moral strength to utter the plain, unvarnished truth. In describing this as a heaven-ordained passion, Woodhull imbues it with a sense of Christian morality, implicitly challenging those who called her ideas obscene. She also uses shame, which inevitably invokes authority. Are we indeed so impure that to us all sexual things are impure? This suggests people are ashamed only if they have reason to be. She gets braver as she goes along, at one point describing a mirror held up to the audience to show its imperfections. You are afraid that I may hold up a glass in which you will see your secret deformities, and you scarcely dare to look upon them. In Woodhull's speech, she has the authority to hold the mirror and show others deformities, a word consistent with the eugenic discourse of the time. Woodhull's attachment to eugenics grew stronger once she moved to Great Britain, the birthplace of the ideology. Her legacy as a eugenicist was sealed in her daughter's final will. Zulu Maud, her daughter, left her fortune to a eugenics society with which Margaret Sanger was also affiliated. This gesture helped ensure that the complicated relationship between eugenics and the women's movement, and Woodhull in particular, would continue. So even as we celebrate Woodhull for her dangerous ideas, we should remember that some of her ideas were in fact dangerous to an inclusive women's movement. Such insight does not invalidate Woodhull's importance as a historical figure and early feminist, but it does give us a sense of how much feminism has evolved and how much it continues to need to do so. Thank you.
All right, hi everybody. My name is Linda Schlossberg. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for this generous invitation, and I must apologize for reading from a laptop. I'm the least technologically adept person you would ever meet. So I'm appalled by this version of myself right now. I want to take up some of the ideas that Carrie was just touching on about this concept of maternal eugenics, which to us sounds, kind of nutty, but in the cultural context of the 19th century and early 20th century was really part and parcel of mainstream feminist thought. So feminists such as Margaret Sanger, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, you may know that story, did not see eugenics as being in contradiction to feminist ideals, but instead as being part of those ideals. And the idea here was that women, by virtue of their reproductive capacities, had a special responsibility, a special ability to positively shape the future of the nation, right? By actively choosing to reproduce with men who are morally and physically fit, right? And the idea of, who was fit was obviously a very fraught one. And in discussion, we might talk about that a little bit, but obviously part of the anxiety about fitness at this time was linked to various discourses around immigration and the idea that the United States was becoming, as some writers like Charlotte Perkins Gilman put it, too hospitable to foreigners, and that these people from other countries were diluting the purity of the American body, right? All sorts of interesting sexual and physical anxieties that are at play there. And what's fascinating for us is, we think, okay, the 19th century, even if our knowledge of 19th century America is only limited to something like, say, Little Women, right, or Uncle Tom's Cabin, we know it's a period that really idealizes motherhood, right? And so we think, gosh, how could this be a feminist ideal at the time? I mean, doesn't this just relegate women to their reproductive capacities, right? Isn't it just, part of that same framework? But in the cultural context of the 19th century, when even, white women who were wealthy held very little political power, this concept becomes extremely seductive because, what could be more powerful than this ability to literally breed a better race of Americans? And the terminology that was often used around this, and it wasn't necessarily explicitly said to be about whiteness, but the discourse would be, we are the mothers of a quote unquote new race, right? Or we are creating a new race of Americans. And again, it was this whole kind of idea of physical strength and well-being. And for Woodhull, along with the quite astonishing things she said about free love and sexuality, but part of the idea of this doctrine of free love was about the opportunity to select only the best and most capable partners in reproduction, right? So the idea was not to be stuck with, this pathetic guy who you ended up married to, oh no, but instead to sort of have this privilege to create, again, this kind of better race. And for Woodhull, she often analogized traditional marriage to a kind of sexual slavery, and part of the idea here was that women would be limited in this regard. She had all sorts of other really fascinating claims about motherhood. One, which I find really intriguing, is this idea that the child at times should not be conceived of as sort of the property of an individual set of parents, but is rather, in a sense, sort of a being of society, and that the mother is kind of helping to sort of grow and then raise this future member of society, and that we are mistaken in thinking of children as being simply part of a kind of privatized, what we would now call nuclear family structure. And another thing that she was interested in was sort of providing more kinds of like sanitary conditions for women who were pregnant. And we see all sorts of ways in which these ideas reverberate, of course, in our own current moment, right? There's this real increasing pressure on pregnant women to effectively police their own behavior in order to assure healthy fetal development and optimal birth outcomes, right? So, of course, we all want to promote maternal health. That's obviously a good ideal. And, we can talk about what the current political administration thinks about all that later, but whatever our beliefs around that all are, many people have argued that we're kind of in this cultural moment where there's this sort of increased cultural obsession or almost hysteria around the idea of maternal wellness, right? So that pregnant women, in addition to being asked, obviously not to smoke or take drugs or drink, are sort of told, don't eat sushi, don't eat brie cheese, don't dye your hair, don't use nail polish, don't put on sunscreen. And I mean, I always tell my students, my parents, drank and smoked their way through my mom's pregnancy. And, we see this kind of big generational shift. And I think that we see these recommendations often being defined as being part of a kind of feminist health movement, right? So the way people often frame their interest in sort of natural, beauty products, or when they eat organic food when they're pregnant and such forth, is that it's a way of kind of taking control and power over their bodies and their reproductive outcomes, and it's framed as being in keeping with environmentalist ideals and as being anti-corporate and all this. But there's obviously this whole kind of marketplace for these sorts of products. And the scary side of all of this, of course, is what we might think of as the kind of current policing of women's bodies, and the way in which these discourses around maternal health and wellness align very neatly with conservative ideas about controlling women's bodies and the surveillance of appropriate ways of being pregnant or being a mother. And we've seen in recent years the ways in which pregnant women, especially women of color, have been subject to varying degrees of criminal prosecution and civil interventions under various, quote, fetal endangerment or fetal abuse statutes. A few months ago, Montana prosecutor Gerald Harris called for a, quote, immediate crackdown on women who use alcohol or drugs while pregnant. And the idea was to call on relatives, friends, and even strangers to report instances of, quote, women abusing their innocent unborn children. If there are provable violations, the state will seek to imprison and, quote, incapacitate the women. And the press release around this says, quote, if an expecting mother chooses to abort an unborn child instead of refraining from drug or alcohol use, we trust the Attorney General to make the right decision on behalf of all Montanans and continue this fight to the extent necessary to ensure justice is afforded to the most vulnerable of our society, right? So again, this real surveillance around what constitutes appropriate maternal behavior. You might remember that a couple of years ago, the CDC issued this very controversial recommendation that all women and adolescent girls of reproductive age just refrain from drinking altogether, just in case they happen to get pregnant and happen to damage a hypothetical fetus, right? So whether or not you were currently sexually active, just in case, you should just not drink anything because you might end up damaging this hypothetical child. And we can laugh about it, but what's interesting about this is this concept that women are always conceived of as being, pre-pregnant, right? As these kind of walking wombs who must be, ever vigilant in preparation for a possible baby. And what we're witness to here then is this kind of historical moment in which pregnant women are being conceptualized as, kind of incubators or hosts for a future child. Some of you might remember Oklahoma Representative Justin Humphrey said this thing in a interview where he referred to pregnant women as hosts, right? So the idea was to propose a bill that would require women to get written consent from their male reproductive partners if they wanted to get an abortion. And the idea was that he said, well, I know women think of this as their body, but I actually think of, and he sort of stumbled over the words, and then he said, actually what I think of it is that you're a host, right? As if we're like an Airbnb or something, and the fetus is just kind of a visitor and all of that kind of thing. So basically, we're in this interesting moment. Some people call it a kind of Handmaid's Tale moment, right, where we see the maternal body and the fetus as being sort of locked almost in a kind of almost as if there's like a competing claims, right? Competing civil rights claims that are being discussed. And we can see that the interests, as it were, of the unborn child or the future fetal citizen are being pitted against those of the mother, whose civil liberties are increasingly under attack. So, one moment you're thinking, okay, I shouldn't eat sushi, and then the next moment your civil rights are being taken away. Just in keeping all of this in mind, thinking again about how, we might be sort of drawn to a discourse of the kind that, say, Woodhull and her contemporaries proposed around ideals of, maternal agency and maternal power and stuff, but we want to always be attentive to the ways in which these kind of ideas can slip into other kinds of more nefarious discourses that can be bad for women. So, there.
I'm Phyllis Thompson. I'm a 19th century cultural historian, but I routinely teach 21st century feminism. And so, following from Linda, I'm going to bring this to that place. My brothers and sisters, I'm going to tell you some plain truth tonight I know shall not please all your ears. I value the good opinion of you all, but I value the truth more. And if to gain the former I must withhold one iota of the latter, I shall fail in securing it. That is, of course, Victoria Woodhull, from a piece called The Scarecrows of Sexual Slavery. I vote we let her write all the titles. What does it mean to fully speak truth? And at what risk are we when we raise our voices loudly? What does it mean to speak truth about someone who has done something braver than we will ever do? It is complicated to choose heroes. My students consistently want simple heroes, actors from the past who have spotless intersectional politics. And it's not just that the past is a foreign country where they do things differently, but that we all contain, as Whitman put it, multitudes, some of them quite contradictory. It's especially complicated to find female heroes, it seems. Remember the 2016 Republican primary debate in which the candidates were asked which woman should appear on a $10 bill? So there were two calls for Rosa Parks, which is fine and well. Jeb Bush wanted Margaret Thatcher. Kasich came up with Mother Teresa. This is American money. Mike Huckabee called for his wife, and Ben Carson for his mom. And who do you think our president wanted? Ivanka. Same thing. Okay, so these men literally could not think of a woman from American history worthy of public honor. And then Carly Fiorina, doing no better, called it an empty gesture, not worth it making. We ought to recognize that women are not a special interest group, unlike conventionally empowered white men who should be represented on the money. Okay, why is it so difficult to fixate on a woman worth remembering? And what about a feminist hero? Forget it. We feminists hold each other to impossibly high standards. It's a very difficult thing. Cindy reminded us that Woodhull was invisible to history, to memory, for her imperfections, really. She has a moment of being the most famous woman in America, and she disappears. Why? For these ideas that, as Carrie pointed out, can be dangerous to an inclusive women's movement, right? It's easier to let go than to grapple with those. So Woodhull is really no use to a teleological feminist progress narrative. She's both ahead and behind. Philosopher Marilyn Frye has argued that oppression involves the requirement that you show signs of being happy with the situation in which you find yourself. As she put it, it is often a requirement upon oppressed people that we smile and be cheerful. If we comply, we signify our docility and our acquiescence in our situation. Shall we agree that Victoria Woodhull quite splendidly did not comply? She did something quite distinct. She brings to mind for me the words of theorist Sarah Ahmed. To be recognized as a feminist is to be assigned to a difficult category and a category of difficulty. Woodhull's own life choices did make her a difficult heroine. She was arguably brought down by her insistence on making her own moral choices, exiled from drawing rooms and from histories of feminism. Susan B. Anthony, something of a fair weather friend, noticed she was seen as lewd and indecent. My own research is about discourses of pleasure in private life, and in the 19th century hegemonic discourses, women were encouraged to take pleasure in doing their duty. That is, pleasure was to be had secondhand. And Woodhull was, of course, having none of this. She didn't fit. She wasn't interested in a supporting actor role. But her bombastic claims to power, the radical nature of her proffered solutions, made her more difficult to hear over time. For example, here she is going all Lysistrata. Let women issue a declaration of independence sexually and absolutely refuse to cohabit with men until they're acknowledged as equals in everything, and the victory will be won in a single week, she wrote. Probable, but not practical. Or, I have an inalienable constitutional and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please. This likely caused some kid-gloved hands to be raised to ears. Yet this woman who was so insistent upon her freedoms could equivocate in a way that makes a modern feminist want to reach for the noise-blocking headphones. To wit, she tells us that every woman was a daughter or sister, quote, "No man who respects his mother or loves his sister can speak disparagingly of any woman. However low she may seem to have sunk, she is still a woman. I want every man to remember this. Every woman is, or at some time has been, a sister or daughter." That statement, the Woodhull admiring part of me wants to believe, is a convenient one. Woodhull, in contrast, behaves as an actor in her own right. When she insists on her relationship to love or pleasure or to power, she insists that those relationships not be contingent. And in that, she's bucking her culture. But here, in this statement, she is bearing the voice of her culture, one in which women argued for the vote on the basis of being mothers, when there was a contingency to female citizenship, a special status. But that statement also sounds eerily familiar, right? Every single liberal man quoted in the New York Times in the wake of the Trump pussy-grabbing tape. They repeatedly framed women's dignity in relation to men's. A man sees as an insult as problematic when he imagines how he would feel had it been levied against a woman to whom he is intimately tied. And a commitment to equality requires shifting this mindset so that men can imagine themselves in the role of target. That is, to empathize with women, not as potential sisters or wives, but as potential selves. And I want to pivot here to think about this political moment in which we live, this moment for feminism, one which found its fullest formation subsequent to the formation of this Dangerous Voices, Women Who Dare to Speak Up panel. How can the conundrum of Victoria Woodhull's life help us understand the Me Too moment? In the Me Too era, we pay too much attention to who is speaking. We interrogate the victims, their moral stature, their histories. This pattern, of course, has a long history. Early reports of Harvey Weinstein's behavior came, as has been much discussed, from famous women, women with less to lose. But even they were slow to realize that their raised voices could deliver and not just expose their bearers to danger. Where am I in time? Okay. Lupita Nyong'o noted her rage came when I screwed up my timer. I also am technologically incompetent. Apparently, none of us from the East Coast can handle a computer. When she realized she was part of a pattern, not an isolated incident. And her voice came only when she realized that, quote, there were ears to hear me. She hadn't thought anyone would listen. Or Molly Ringwald. I never talked about these things publicly because as a woman, it always felt to me like I may as well have been talking about the weather. In recognition of this, Judge Rosemary Aquilino brought 160 women to testify to their pain, their stories, to create a space in which we all had to open our ears, in which that weather system raged, in which Larry Nassar, over his objections, had to listen. So what stories do our master narratives of feminism accommodate or not accommodate over time? The courtroom had had no space to accommodate those stories in full, so the fact that it was open to them was in itself news. How might we split open the world further, make sense of more narratives, messier narratives? How might we welcome a multiplicity of truths? This is what I ask my students to do, to imagine more complicated futures, not clearer pasts, to force the road to turn in more than one direction. For example, back to Me Too, what can we do with Asia Argento? Initially a great heroine, white, beautiful, backed by a powerful man, but she loses all credibility in her suffering for having caused suffering. She's a failed heroine. Here's another example. Having been unexpectedly alone in a room with a man who wielded direct professional power and later called to account for not having changed the course of the evening's events, one victim of a harassment power play commented, "Maybe if I were stronger, I was so stunned by the turn that it took. Maybe other people would be stronger in that circumstance, but it's just how I conducted myself. I hope I'll never have another opportunity. Maybe if I did it again, I would do it better." So that was James Comey, the boss of every blue-jacketed team that ever spread out in a hostage-filled cabin. As in any movie, the lone hero is a myth. None of us are perfectly strong alone. There is no one person who can save us, now or in the past or the future. How do we build a feminist narrative supple enough to accommodate surprising forms of power and harm? The Avital Ronell story has been catastrophic in the spectacle of academic feminists closing ranks. How were we, to digest the bitterness of abuse being generated at the hands of one of our own? It undermined a narrative that had itself been so costly and risky in the building. How are we to listen to make space for a more complicated story if we keep yearning for heroes and sheroes? How do we allow everyone not contingent or relational citizenship, but central, fully manifested citizenship? Woodhull wanted a simple story in certain ways: money, the power of executive office, but she, like most of us, was forced to settle. But when we thousand Victorias rise, phoenix-like from her ashes, can we find ways to honor the good without forgetting the regrettable? Can forgiveness and accountability be fellow travelers? Can we seek to understand rather than to recuperate? What can you do next time you hear a story to complicate it? For understanding history is fundamentally about understanding stories and their work: political, discursive, affective, ethical, epistemological. And when we insist upon a progress narrative or upon the creation of heroes and villains, we flatten the past. And this move is critical to our own sense that we're doing better, that we're finally recognizing the right people, but it's a boost to our imperfect selves, to our blindnesses. Can we listen more carefully to the past? And can we find a way to live with the discomfort of imperfect stories, without apology, but with hope?
I'm kind of speechless. That was fabulous, all of our panelists. Thank you to all of you again. So now comes the really good part where you get to engage with our panelists. Are there any questions? I would have a couple that I could throw out, but anyone have something to start us off? Yes.
I think there were a lot of wonderful points about caution, and Phyllis, your talk was very thought-provoking on that, about not wanting to see Victoria Woodhull as a hero. But I am wondering, as somebody who doesn't know a great deal about her, so I'm probably a good representative sample, what are the lessons that her life and career offer for us in this political moment and around Me Too or anything? I'm also thinking specifically from the last election about the way that Clinton, as an orator, a public speech, what are some lessons there maybe about women in public life? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think I'm going to defer to the Woodhull experts.
Well, thinking about the election always makes me profoundly depressed, so I'll just try to not do that.
Collectively cry.
Yes, we could. It's interesting, when you were talking, I was just thinking about some of what I've heard about how she responded to, for a woman to be up in front of people was at the time even quite unusual. And so she was dealing with that, and just in terms of claiming a public voice was kind of unusual for a woman at the time. So she would, in some ways, like when she spoke before a congressional committee, which was one of her first speaking events, she started by having a shaky voice and seeming kind of nervous, and performing a kind of femininity. And she always, she would, I think, do that in certain ways throughout her life. And I know there's been critiques about Hillary in terms of her candidate or her campaign director, talking about how she ran her too much as the woman who needed to be a man. Because that was the mode that she thought that would be most successful, and the idea was that it didn't work. So I think it's interesting to think about how gender works at the time then and now, and if Victoria was successful partly because she was able to, in some way, be feminine enough, and if perhaps Clinton somehow was not, or maybe she was, maybe that has an effect there. So that's just one thing that comes to mind. In terms of other,
Can I interject a small thing before turning it right back?
Yeah.
There was an article in the New York Times this morning about women running for office right now, and the title was something like, "We're all moms here." And it was talking about how they were bringing their children to campaign events and leading with the children. And there was absolutely no contextualization or interrogation of why this had to happen or why this was a savvy move or a kind of, it's a counterpoint to the way in which Clinton positioned herself. And I think it's taking a lesson from the way Woodhull was vilified.
Yeah.
And so we're watching this moment, but one of the ways in which that story is not being made complicated is looking at the necessity of being twice as canny and working twice as hard. Right.
Well, the flap over New Zealand's new prime minister is a parallel to that. She's not married. She just had a baby. 6 weeks after baby. It's the outrage you hear in Australia and other countries, not New Zealand.
Right.
How does she dare do that?
Right. And it's the dare. How dare you?
How dare you?
How dare you sully our public fantasy?
Well, she
this
was
way, right?
pregnant when she was running, so I mean,
Yeah.
they
Well, but how
thought-
dare right? Yeah.
What do they think?
Maybe it was just going to evaporate.
Oh, what I
Mirage.
what I see to some degree, I see an element that there is a general discomfort with powerful women, whether they're in government, in business, or in religion. And because I have spent so many years comparing and contrasting the careers of Victoria Woodhull and Mary Baker Eddy, who really were polar opposites in their viewpoints on a lot of things, not everything, but it's much more difficult to say that Mary Baker Eddy was bucking the conventions, and because in terms of marriage and morality and the Christian worldview, she did everything right. And she advocated for doing everything, for following the rules of morality strictly. And yet, she was also vilified. She was also defamed and painted in a very negative picture in the media. So there's definitely something more going on there.
So with what you're saying then, it's not necessarily the issue about which you're arguing. It's the fact that a woman would argue any issue.
The mere fact.
Yeah, I think the mere fact of a woman seeking a very high level of power is in itself dangerous. It's threatening to this status quo.
Well, in some way, it's complicated to draw a power lesson from Victoria Woodhull because she gets visibility, but she doesn't manage to accrue the kind of power that forces change. So she's not a useful lesson in, for example, how to run a campaign and end up in jail, right? I mean, but it is an object lesson in, well, if you're going to be reviled, go for broke, right? If you need to move the cultural needle, right? But I think it is complicated to use her as any sort of political lesson for that reason.